Hey guys, Mr. Backerberg here. In this video, we're going to look at solving quadratic equations using the square root method. Now, as we're looking at quadratic equations, typically we're looking at something that's got ax squared plus bx plus c. But when we're using this square root method, this only works if the b value is 0. So, if you've got an equation like 3x squared minus 9x plus 6 equals 0, this one won't work using the square root method because the b value isn't 0. But if you've got an equation like 2x squared minus 8 equals 0, notice there is no plain x in there, so the b value is 0, so this one we can do the square root method on. So now let's talk about how the square root method works. So if we had the equation x squared equals 25. When we're solving an equation, our goal is to always get the variable all by itself. So as we look at the left-hand side, x is not all by itself. It's got that squared power on there. Well, in order to get a variable alone, we always use inverse operations or opposite operations. So if we want to get rid of that squared power, we want to think to ourselves, what's the inverse or what's the opposite of squaring something? And that's where the square root comes into play. The opposite of doing x squared is taking the square root of that. But whatever we do to one side of our equation, we also have to do to the other side. So if I square root the x squared, I also have to square root the 25. Now when I do the square root of x squared, because the squared and the square root are inverses of each other, they will cancel each other out, leaving us with just a plain x. Now as far as the right-hand side goes, when we square root the 25, we want to think about numbers that if we were to square them, if we were to multiply them by themselves, we would get 25 as our answer. And we have to be really careful in here. Most people automatically can find 5. But there's actually another number that will work as well. 5 times 5 gives us 25, but also if we did negative 5 times negative 5, well, taking two negatives and multiplying them together results in a positive answer. So that would also be 25. So 5 works, but negative 5 also works. Now we can put both of these answers together, and the way we do that is by putting a plus and a minus in front of the 5. So saying x equals plus or minus 5, that means that x equals 5 and x also equals negative 5. Now as we take a look at this example, this one gets a little bit more complicated because now I put a number in front of that x squared. So this one has 2x squared equals 8. And again, our goal is to get that x all by itself. But right now we've got this extra multiplying happening. So before we jump into actually doing the square root, we need to get rid of that multiplication first. And the opposite of multiplying by 2 is dividing by 2. And whatever I do to one side, I also have to do to the other side. Now on the left-hand side, those 2's are going to cancel each other out, so I get x squared equals, and then on the right-hand side, if I take 8 and divide it by 2, I get 4. Now I still need to get rid of that squared on my x, so this is where I'm going to use my square root. And again, whatever I do to one side, I also have to do to the other side. So on the left-hand side, the squared and the square root cancel out because they're inverses. So we just get x equals. And again, we want to think about the numbers that if we were to multiply them by themselves, we would get 4 as our answer. And just like we saw in the last example, there's actually going to be 2 answers. If we were to take 2 times 2, that would give me 4. So one answer is just 2. But again, like we talked about with the 5 and the negative 5, if I were to multiply 2 negative 2's together, that would also give me positive 4. So also in here, x equals negative 2. But just like I did on the previous one, I'm going to take these 2 separate answers and put them together as one answer. So x equals plus or minus 2. Taking a look at this one, we've got m squared minus 18 equals negative 18. So we're trying to figure out what our variable value is. Now as I look at the left-hand side, I see that minus 18 happening over there with the m squared. Well, if I want to cancel out a minus 18, the opposite of subtraction is addition. So I'm going to add 18 on both sides. So on the left-hand side, The plus 18 and the minus 18 cancel each other out. So we get m squared equals, now on the right-hand side, if I take negative 18, but then add 18 to it, I just get 0. So I have m squared equals 0. But I still want to get rid of that squared power, so I need to square root both sides. So on the left-hand side, the squared and the square root cancel each other out. So I get m equals. Now, as far as square rooting 0, the only number that if you multiply it by itself to get 0 as your answer, the only thing that works there is 0. So our answer this time is m equals 0. One more example to take a look at on this page. So we've got b squared plus 14 equals 5. So I want to get that b squared alone. I see that plus 14 happening. So I'm going to subtract 14 on both sides. So on the left-hand side, the plus 14 and the minus 14 cancel each other out. So I get b squared equals. Now on the right-hand side, 5 minus 14 is going to be negative 9. And then I want to get rid of the squared power that's on the b. So I want to square root both sides. So on the left-hand side, the squared and the square root cancel each other out. So I get b equals. Now as far as the right-hand side goes, I'm trying to square root negative 9. So I want to think to myself, what number can I multiply by itself to get negative 9? Well, if I were to take 3 times 3, that gives me positive 9. And if I were to take negative 3 times negative 3, that also gives me positive 9. If I'm trying to get negative 9, I would have to do positive 3 times negative 3. But with the whole squaring thing, we're supposed to be multiplying a number by itself. And 3 and negative 3 are not the same number. So actually, we can't square root this one. You're not allowed to square root negative numbers. So this one has no solution because we cannot do square roots of negative numbers. Taking a look at this example, it gets a little more complicated because I've added more operations to this equation. So we've got 2x squared plus 11 equals 43. Well, if we think about solving an equation, we want to get rid of addition or subtraction first. So the very first thing I see is that plus 11. I want to get rid of plus 11 by subtracting 11 on both sides. So that's going to give me 2x squared equals 32. But I still need to get rid of that 2 that's attached to the x squared. And that really means 2 times x squared. So to get rid of that multiplying, I'm going to divide both sides by 2. So that leaves me with x squared equals 16. Now to get rid of that squared power, this is where we're going to do the square root. So the squared and the square root cancel each other out, so I get x equals. Now square rooting that 16, thinking about the number that if you multiply it by itself, you get 16, well that number is 4. But just like we had in our previous examples, we have to account for the positive answer and also the negative answer, because negative 4 times negative 4 would also be 16. So I'm going to put a plus and a minus in front of my 4. Taking a look at this example, I've got 5w squared plus 12 equals negative 8. I see the plus 12 in there, so the very first thing I want to do is subtract 12 on both sides. So I get 5w squared equals negative 20. I need to get rid of that 5 that's attached to the w squared, so I'm going to divide both sides by 5. So I get w squared equals negative 4. But then in order to get rid of the squared power, I want to square root both sides. Now as I'm doing this, I notice right away that I'm trying to square root negative 4. And we just said on the previous slide that we're not allowed to square root negative numbers. So this one has no solution. Again, because you cannot square root negative numbers. Now sometimes as we're solving our equation, we might end up with fractions in there. So let's take a look at this one as we're solving it. We've got 4z squared equals 9. If I wanted to get rid of that 4 that's attached to the z squared, I would divide both sides by 4. And I get z squared equals, well, 9 divided by 4. 9 doesn't divide by 4 nicely, so I'm just going to leave it as a fraction for right now. Because what I do notice is that both of those numbers, 9 and 4, end up being perfect squares. So here's what I'm going to do. To get rid of that squared power, I'm still going to square root both sides. So on the left-hand side, the squared and the square root cancel each other out, so I just get z equals. Now on the right-hand side, when you're square rooting a fraction, One property of square roots with fractions allows you to square root both the top and the bottom separately. So let's think about 9 first. A number times itself that would give us 9 would be 3. And if we think about the bottom, a number times itself that would give us 4, well, that would be 2. So the square root of 9/4 simplifies down into 3/2, 3 over 2. But like we talked about before with our other examples, we do have to account for both the positive and the negative answers. So I'm going to put a plus and a minus in front of this fraction, because it could be positive 3/2 or it could be negative 3/2. One other thing that might happen is we might not end up with a nice square rootable number as we're going through and solving things. So sometimes it's appropriate to type these into your calculator. So here on this one, once we get down to the square rooting portion, we're going to type it into our calculator, and we're going to round it off to the nearest hundredth. So that means 2 decimals. So we've got 3x squared minus 11 equals 7. So the first thing I see is that minus 11. If I want to get rid of minus 11, I'm going to have to add 11 to both sides. So I will get 3x squared equals 18. To get rid of that 3 that's attached to the x squared, well, that means 3 times x squared. So I need to divide both sides by 3. So I get x squared equals 6. Now in here, to get rid of that squared power, I need to square root both sides. On the left-hand side, the squared and the square root cancel each other out. So I get x equals. Now 6 is not a nice perfect square. So here's where we're going to bring our calculator in. I want to square root that 6. So on my calculator, right above my x squared button, there's a little square root symbol. So I can go second x squared, and that'll put the square root in there. And I want to do the square root of 6. So I hit enter, and if I round off to the hundredths, or 2 decimal places, I get 2.45. But just like we were doing before, we do want to account for the positive and the negative answers. So our calculator won't put the plus and the minus in there, but when we give our final answers, we need to. So it's plus or minus 2.45 as our final answer on this one. That's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching.